Greetings, JupyterCon. My name is CL Cao, and I'm from Infuse AI. I'm going to talk about practical enterprise JupyterHub deployment and MLOps with PrimeHub. A little history about how I got involved with Jupyter. A good friend of mine started a nonprofit training program to democratize AI for the local industries back in 2017. One day I got a call saying, hey, we've got 200 people sign up for the first class already, and we have 30 GPU servers by donation. Do you have an idea how we run these courses? I did a little bit of searching and then say, oh, there's this thing called Kubernetes and then JupyterHub. I bet we can put together a Jupyter training environment with a little bit of effort. I ended up set up the courses for system for them. And then during the course, we found the enterprise scenario for large-scale Jupyter deployment is actually pretty underserved. So in 2018, I studied a company, Infuse AI, and then launched our product, PrimeHub, for enterprise Jupyter deployments. In 2019, we also released the core part of PrimeHub as open source community edition available on GitHub. In the meantime, I've been very intrigued by the love-hate relationship between data scientists and notebooks. The JupyterCon 2018 talk by Joel covered a lot of the debates. Well, this reminds me of the story about Kremer Prize, which was a challenge for human-powered aircraft back in 1959. The first person to crack this challenge, McCready, actually redefined the problem to invent a way to rapidly rebuild aircraft so he can run many trials. That is say, by improving the process by 2 orders of magnitude, you start to invent the impossible. And I think this is what Jupyter is about for the analytics community. Now back to Jupyter, which is now quite accessible for a single user use case. A pip install away, or enter a desktop environment, or vscode plugin, or online services such as Colab. However, if you want to run a multi-user Jupyter environment for your organization or your team, it starts to get a little bit more complicated. You need to get the cluster ready, and then follow the Zero to JupyterHub with Kubernetes guide, or a smaller installation such as Little's JupyterHub. More importantly, when you run such services, the users will start having very different demands about what their environment should be like. Here are a few common challenges for having a larger Jupyter environment in enterprises. First of all is the team concept, where a group of people could have the same configuration for the data they have access to, as well as consistent environment. They oftentimes also want a shared volume, which they can rewrite intermediate data files to collaborate on. Secondly is the multi-tenancy of the above-mentioned team concept, where they are isolated and with predefined resource quota to prevent resource oversubscription. Thirdly is a managed environment often poses restrictions. So it's a challenge for allowing the user to customize their environment to their needs. And lastly, there are other enterprise requirements such as self-signed certs or air-capped environment. But we'll focus on the first 3 and then see how PrimeHub is helpful for us. From the end user's perspective, in addition to the common JupyterHub spawner launcher page, you get the context for which team you're launching the instance from. And then you have the predefined instance type. They are sort of like the environment of the machines that you can spawn. And the images that are predefined that could be suited for GPU and CPU. And then the resource summary for the team that is currently consuming and the quota for the team. And finally, the data set that's available by default for anyone launching a notebook from the team. In PrimeHub admin console, you can configure the predefined instance types that are available for a particular team to use. as well as the team's total resource usage constraints, such as CPU, GPU, and memory. Similarly, teams can be configured with access to persistent volume as dataset, with either read-only or rewrite access. To configure a shared read-write volume for teams, this is often involving pre-provisioning a large NFS server or other rewrite many capable file system, and it's usually difficult to isolate for per-team usage. In PrimeHub, there is a handy option where a shared volume can be dynamically created for you with any backing read-write once storage class. We turn that into a rewrite many shared volume. The volume is then automatically mounted for all the users in that team. To give user more flexibility, such as port forwarding to a locally run service or using vscode read mode, PrimeHub provides SSH access through a Bayesian SSH service with minimum key configuration. Of course, based on Teams work, VS Code and RStudio are supported if it's built into the image. This is just the same as any JupyterHub environment. In that case, we can provide user more flexibility about what their actual environment to use to work with. Also, there's a challenge to make the Jupyter Lab version more managed. So we also support a kernel gateway-based image, but this is still somewhat experimental in terms of usability. Next, I will talk about the design in PrimeHub and how the components are working together. For those of you familiar with JupyterHub, there is a feature called the dynamic profile list, and we make extensive use of that. We store the user and group metadata in Keycloak, which is an open source identity management system that supports role-based authorization and identity federation. The objects that the user have access to, such as instance type and images, are stored as Kubernetes custom resources definition, and we have the role binding on Keycloak. And then there is a GraphQL server that combines all the query and then decides that what the user will be able to see for the profile list to render. So in summary, the role binding for the custom resources are stored in Keycloak, and the additional group attributes such as the quota are stored in Keycloak as well. And then we have a unified API using GraphQL to wrap them around. This architecture provides a flexible foundation for PrimeHub to further support shared services within team, such as a dashboard or Streamlit apps.
The final part of the talk is about MLOps, which is a popular term for productionizing and operating ML models. The intention is for breaking the data science, data engineering, ML engineering silos, where at least two of them are heavily influenced by Jupyter. There are a couple of challenges. One is lack of standardized pipeline. We have many ways to do it. And then they sort of diverge from the development workflow. Secondly, the way that models are packaged and deployed are not very standardized. Thirdly, there are many ways to version control the entire ML cycle, but again, it's not very standardized. While best practices are still emerging to tackle these challenges, let's take a look from the perspective of the Jupyter ecosystem. Treating notebook as a functional unit is the first step to make it part of a reproducible workflow. We're currently implementing support for invoking papermill as submitted job from within a Jupyter Lab extension, as well as treating a function as job via decorator.
In PrimeHub's enterprise offering, we provide jobs and schedule management for teams to run or queue jobs subject to their resource constraints. For operationalizing an ML, we also provide model deployment management and monitoring with API to manage model lifecycle. Usage reporting are especially useful in on-prem environment to see overall resource utilization for things aggregated from notebook, interactive notebook or jobs. Here are the roadmap items for PrimeHub CE. We like to add per team add-ons, such as experiment tracking services like MLflow or services for sharing dashboard or streaming apps within groups or within the entire organization. We also want to implement a good default that promotes a version everything environment to make sure the workflow is natively reproducible. Well, PrimeHub is open source, and we'd like to hear your input to see what's helpful. It has been incredible to be part of the Jupyter community, and we are proud to sponsor this year's JupyterCon. Although it's virtual, please come by and hang out. Thank you for your time.